As is the case with so many ancient philosophers, precious little is known about the life of Iamblichus, the Neoplatonist. What we can piece together comes by way of the biographical reports of Eunapius of Sardis, a sophist of the late 4th century, and from what we can infer from Iamblichus's own writings, such as the life of Pythagoras, De Anima, De Mysteriis, and various commentaries on Plato and Aristotle. Unfortunately for the entire field of Western esotericism, Iamblichus's treatise on the gods is lost. Iamblichus was born in Chalcis, northern Syria, to an illustrious and wealthy family around 243 AD. According to Damascius, Iamblichus may have descended from the royal line of priest-kings of Emesa. He was certainly afforded an early education where he distinguished himself, becoming a pupil of one Anatolius until he apparently attached himself to Porphyry, the great student of Plotinus, who also compiled Plotinus's Enneads and wrote his brief biography. When we enter Iamblichus's life, he is already a full-fledged philosopher, influenced heavily by the teachings of Plato, Pythagoras, and Hermes, and in the company of other Platonic students from Syria, Cappadocia, and Greece. Iamblichus is at once a devoted philosopher of the simple life, and in many ways a full-fledged Pythagorean. Where his writings are said to be somewhat abrasive or lacking in eloquence, when he orated he seemed to please a wider audience, and his conversation is compared with a nectar that his pupils could never get enough of. Although his writings tend to lean toward the obscure and certainly the esoteric, which is to say De Anima and De Mysteriis are highly complicated texts, no one could ever fault him for any lack of devotion to his studies or his companions. Occasionally, quote, he did perform certain rites alone, apart from his friends and disciples, when he worshipped the divine being. But for the most part he conversed with his pupils and was unexacting in his mode of life and of an ancient simplicity. Once a certain eloquent student among Iamblichus's circle asked him, "O master most inspired, why do you thus occupy yourself in solitude, instead of sharing with us your more perfect wisdom? Nevertheless, a rumor has reached us through your slaves that when you pray to the gods, you soar aloft from the earth, more than 10 cubits to all appearance, that your body and your garments change to a beautiful golden hue, and presently when your prayer is ended, your body becomes as it was before you prayed, and then you come down to earth and associate with us." Iamblichus made a rare show of laughter at this question and this assertion of levitation, saying, "The facts are otherwise. For the future, however, you shall be present at all that goes on." One story of the divine manifestations of Iamblichus occurred around the hour of sacrifice, apparently in the Syrian city of Apamea. Iamblichus and his company left one of his suburban villas and headed to the city, conversing about the gods at a leisurely pace, when, quote, suddenly Iamblichus, even while conversing, was lost in thought, as though his voice were cut off, and for some moments he fixed his eyes steadily on the ground, and then looked up at his friends and called them in a loud voice, "Let us go by another road, for a dead body has lately been carried along this way." Not long after, some of his companions confirmed that indeed a body was carried along that road earlier in the day. This event inspired some interest as to Iamblichus's intuitive powers, but there were still those that pestered him about it, saying it was only due to his acute sense of smell. Iamblichus weathered more requests for a demonstration and made it clear that this kind of performance is irreverent to the gods. But on one summer day, Iamblichus was said to have reluctantly summoned out 2 handsome water spirits from springs, who had not been seen in the water before he appeared to draw them out of the depths. This rarely related story, admittedly transmitted through hearsay, and certainly not the kind of event Iamblichus would ever boast of, apparently satisfied his growing number of disciples. And as Eunapius tells us, even more astonishing and marvelous things were related of him. There was another event that Eunapius did share about a certain Egyptian who invoked the god Apollo. The god came in a vision to the amazement of those present, but Iamblichus saw through this ruse, saying, "My friends, cease to wonder, this is only the ghost of a gladiator." Eunapius implies Iamblichus knew this because he beheld things with the intelligence and not with the deceitful eyes of the flesh. And this becomes more intriguing when you consider Iamblichus's temperament as one who always seems to correct errors in the judgment of other philosophers. It is unfortunate that not all of Iamblichus's known theurgical acts were recorded, but, as we will see, their nature and function were certainly explained in detail, where it is clearly implied that Iamblichus had personal experience of a great range of phenomena. After all, it is Iamblichus who must take credit for developing theurgy as a core practice of Neoplatonism, but we have good reason to believe he did not act alone in this, but rather took many cues from the accessible so-called Chaldean oracles and the Greco-Egyptian Hermetic literature, which he admittedly consults to inform his philosophy. We might go further to suggest Iamblichus was in possession of an ancient wisdom tradition which traced back, without admitting any proof, to priestly teachings maintained in ancient Egypt, such as that theology in Memphis in the middle of the 2nd millennium. However, we don't need to speculate but so far, considering we have every reason to believe he drew much of his Egyptian perspectives from the Egyptian high priest Manetho and Manetho's History of Egypt, and other works which are entirely lost. Iamblichus certainly studied the writings of the Egyptian priest and Stoic philosopher Chaeremon, who lived in the 1st century and whose works are also lost to history. Though Iamblichus was Porphyry's pupil, he eventually returned to Syria and founded a Platonic school in Apamea, where there were many discourses, debates, lengthy penetrations into questions, and courses of study revolving mostly around the writings of Plato. Iamblichus's lasting influence on Platonism was affected and vindicated through the later Athenian Platonism of Syrianus and Proclus, and certainly established more of a religious element to Platonism that emphasizes ritual theurgy over theology and contemplative mysticism. Proclus himself is reported to have performed certain theurgical acts by Marinus, such as inducing rainfall over Athens, delivering accurate prophecies, healing, and encountering gods in dreams and visions. Maximus, the theurgist and advisor to Emperor Julian, is also said to have performed divinations and wonders. Theurgy literally means God work or divine action, whereas theology is God talk to Iamblichus. In this way, Iamblichus's theurgy is one of the core practices that distinguishes Neoplatonism from Middle and Early Platonism. Of course, the so-called Neoplatonists themselves don't always agree in this regard, and Neoplatonism is a term that was invented in the 18th century for the organization of scholars. But this more religious element of the divine Iamblichus, which was the appellation bestowed on him by later admirers, bolstered the pagan religious material Emperor Julian sought to use in re-establishing pagan systems across his Roman Empire. Emperor Julian stated to the receptor of his oration on the Sovereign Son that, "If you are desirous of more perfect and mystic discourses on this subject, by revolving the books of the divine Iamblichus composed with the same design as the present oration, you will find the perfect consummation of human wisdom." And, quote, "For I well know that no one can speak more perfectly on this subject than Iamblichus." In his oration on the Mother of the Gods, Julian also says boldly that he was posterior indeed in time, but not in genius, to Plato. In this essay, we will focus exclusively on De Mysteriis, or on the Mysteries. With this text, Iamblichus proves to be extremely well versed in the Greek philosophical tradition, and assuredly that of Pythagoras, giving credit, however, to the more ancient thinking of Chaldeans, Assyrians, and Egyptians, along with the Hermetic books, of which he accessed probably more than we currently know to exist today. I note that in no existing work does he mention the Christians or Jesus. However, he does note that there are certain atheists who falsely attribute all divination to the accomplishment of the evil daemon, which is a possible reference to the dogmatic Christians of his time. Now, this work on the Mysteries is written as a response to Porphyry's letter to Anibo, and it will help if the reader has already made good study of Plato, Plotinus, the Corpus Hermeticum, and in general has a more advanced status in esoteric studies. Iamblichus doesn't write on the Mysteries under his own name, but under the pseudonym of one Egyptian prophet, Abammon, the alleged teacher of a disciple, Anibo. Abammon, as a name, conveys no known meaning other than it sounds Egyptian. But Iamblichus tells Porphyry specifically not to concern himself with the identity of the author, whether it be one or many, but rather to focus entirely on what is written. But why write under a pseudonym like this? Well, perhaps it is in part because Porphyry's questions require that Iamblichus utilize more ancient traditions to provide the answers, which in this case appears to be that of Egyptian priests who ascribed all of their own writings to Hermes. More on this later. Before we get to the text and the commentary, I emphasize a few Iamblichean themes that distinguish him from other Neoplatonists. Iamblichus is concerned here with correcting many dogmas and innovations of the Greeks, but he doesn't make his corrections based on his own original speculation, but on his personal experience and on the ancient systems that Pythagoras and Plato knew before, including what they derived from the Pillars of Hermes when they traveled to Egypt. In this way, Iamblichus, as Abammon, establishes himself as a mediator between ancient and modern approaches, joining the end to the beginning, as it were. Porphyry's questions, too, are of the kind asked by initiates seeking light on exact matters of the soul and the greater spiritual cosmos. Iamblichus presents the apparent true nature of the gods, which the profane have distorted, classifies properly the ranks and hierarchies of divine beings, and differentiates himself from Plotinus by teaching that ritual work and not only contemplative mysticism is required for ascension, and that the soul is truly sunken into this mundane existence. Although the soul is not literally damaged by its association with matter, it is more capable through ignorance of allowing the passions of the body and the evils of the world to deter our ascent. Therefore, it is necessary for higher beings who lack our imperfections to participate in our journey to Henosis. Theurgy is far from the vulgar magic of the self-serving sorcerer, but the means of correcting the confusion inflicted on the soul. Theurgy is an embodiment of the gods in human form, or the harmonization with a god or higher being, to such a degree that a mutual action is effected by the theurgist and the divinity at once. Theurgy is manifested primarily through ritual, and encompasses the whole range of psychic and paranormal phenomena such as possession, remote viewing, precognition, telepathy, levitation, weather alteration, spontaneous involuntary action, and much, much more. Iamblichus, however, is at pains to emphasize that Theurgy is nothing like the sorcery of the common magician, but is a royal and pure art, which, far from compelling the gods to do anything, is more akin to the individual's realization of an internally manifest God in order to activate and proceed into ascension. Theurgy is not merely a series of phenomena and rituals or a fancy way of pretending to be wiser than other philosophers, but is the method of Iamblichean salvation. Now, De Mysteriis itself is not only a methodical refutation of almost every aspect of Porphyry's letter to Anibo, but an unwavering defense of Theurgy written under the important guise of an Egyptian prophet. I begin with the first paragraph of the text. Quote, "Hermes, the god who presides over rational discourse, has long been considered, quite rightly, to be the common patron of all priests. He who presides over true knowledge about the gods is one and the same, always and everywhere. It is to him that our ancestors in particular dedicated the fruits of their wisdom, attributing all their own writings to Hermes. Iamblichus then, for his part, suggests he is partaking of the same favor of Hermes in this task of writing, and he writes at a time when the Greek god Hermes and the ancient Egyptian god Thoth had become fully amalgamated into Hermes Trismegistus, to the point that the Greek-speaking Egyptians, living under Roman rule, spoke of Hermes as their own native deity. But this first paragraph answers, at least for some of us who are obsessed with Hermes, a great deal of questions. For one, it hints that the Corpus Hermeticum, or the 17 tractates attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, were recognized to have been written by numerous priests, each assuming the title of Hermes by tradition, much like earlier Egyptian priests assumed the title of Thoth in the Thoth cult writings. This lines up well with Clement of Alexandria's description of a Hermetic priesthood, who each carried a textbook authored by Hermes on every relevant subject. Hermes is not just a pseudonym in this sense, but a theonym, and the author assuming his name is admitting to embodying some inspired literary state and intellective attributes maintained by the god. We should remember also how many thousands of books were attributed to Hermes even in Manetho's time, or in 300 BC, which is a convincing piece of data demonstrating just how deep the Hermetic authorial tradition goes. I also note that we should remember when it comes to theurgy the ancient Egyptian understanding that the deceased soul has the opportunity to become Osiris, as it is told in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Since this work is so replete with insights and dense with challenges, I focus primarily on certain highlights and major passages. When Iamblichus writes of the methods he will use to answer Porphyry's questions, he eventually says, quote, "Some of these, such as require experience of actions for their accurate understanding, it will not be possible to deal with adequately by words alone." I've always loved this bit because it speaks to a truth that eludes the merely contemplative. Iamblichus rather exhaustively communicates that certain knowledge is simply unavailable to those who lack experience or cannot induce or produce it. Even were these experiences put into words, they would be meaningless to those who have not lived them. This highlights an aspect of Iamblichus's shrewd, and dare we say more scientific, personality. He doesn't suggest theology based on speculation, but claims to know what he knows based on personal theurgical experience. Now take this decisive feature of Iamblichus and apply it to his perspectives, and you get a philosopher who stands out across the entire scope of Western esoteric history. Iamblichus asserts that knowledge of the gods is not something to be conceded or intellectualized alone, but is an innate and natural knowledge, coexistent with the human being from the beginning. Quote, "For it is rather the case that we are enveloped by the divine presence, and we are filled with it, and we possess our very essence by virtue of our knowledge that there are gods." This also goes for other beings such as daemons, heroes, and pure souls, who are each differentiated based on their essence, potency, and activity. These beings, along with the gods, establish 4 classes, and occupy the same place in Iamblichus's hierarchy as they do later in the ranking system outlined by the Platonist Heracles of Alexandria. After a rather turgid establishment of the classes of beings such as gods, daemons, heroes, and pure souls, Iamblichus writes, quote, "The one of these extremes is at the summit, and transcendent and perfect, while the other is at the bottom, deficient and relatively imperfect. The one can achieve all things simultaneously, in the present instant, unitarily, while the other can achieve neither all things, nor all at once, nor suddenly, nor indivisibly." This is all to say that the former, most perfect and singular God principle is necessarily the object of the lesser principles who are, in this optimistic case, continually involved in rising back to the first principles and greater states of being. Thus there is one ultimate primary, or the highest iteration of the Platonic one, and infinite gradations of downward, and outward-tending secondaries. All of these secondaries, however, never totally become separated from the one, except by degrees of being. For Iamblichus, we might say the incarnate soul exists in the lowest possible degree of downward differentiation. In this state, we are capable of following any number of illusions and delusional attachments, and those grades of being more aligned with the one are, as a result, increasingly incomprehensible. For Iamblichus, however, it was not satisfactory or productive to withdraw totally from the body, but rather to incorporate the body in the process of rising into higher levels of being. We're not assigned a body by chance in the Iamblichean framework, but we live a, quote, life that the soul proposed to itself even before it was enveloped in a human body. And this incorporeal state of our souls beyond the body is more real than the world we inhabit while tethered to the body. Quote, in fact, the truly real, and that which is essentially incorporeal, is everywhere that it wishes to be. Iamblichus here describes features of existence that apply to divine entities, including our own souls, when they are not animating bodies. The disembodied soul, as much as the gods, exhibits a non-linear bilocality, or the potential to be everywhere in which the universal consciousness already is, far from being limited by the usual parameters of a physical experience. If we do not understand that the far-reaching powers and potentials of superior beings such as gods and daemons also allow for the mingling of gods and men, then who could profess to knowing anything about the gods? We would have no basis for claiming such knowledge, and the gods would never engage or reveal themselves in any way. Thus, with Theurgy, Iamblichus lays his understanding of divinities onto experiential grounds, which is the only basis for gaining facts about the gods, when the other approach is solely intellectual. Iamblichus appears to quote Thales in saying, "All things are full of gods." The gods and the superior beings are not contained by bodies, but contain bodies suitable to their will, much like the sun's light envelops all things on the earth, while nothing on the earth can trap it. As Iamblichus says of the celestial beings, quote, "They are not themselves converted to body, but they have a body which is converted to its divine cause, and that body does not impede their intellectual and incorporeal perfection, nor occasion them any molestation by its intervention." All lower entities and lesser grades of being are generated or exist in their allotted potencies on account of the actions of higher beings, stemming all the way to the nous, or the singular universal mind. To participate with higher beings is then to participate in world-creating, reality-shaping energies, whose will cannot be coerced through sorcery, but matched in harmony, so that the individual theurgist is no longer a vessel of the self, but a partner with divine powers that resonate beyond the limitation of the self. Considering the divine light is always everywhere, and everywhere the same, there is in both the beginning and ending stages of everything the same light that joins the ends to the beginnings, much as the human being representing the end of a particular downward deviation from incorporeal life can join with the gods, representing a more beginning stage of the nous as it seemingly splits into distinguishable entities. Therefore, in no ways can gods be totally conveyed by the visible images we make of them. These are rather tools to bring ourselves into a state of harmony. These are, like Plato said of the planets, decorations that represent an underlying truth that neither the senses nor the rational mind can fully comprehend. In regards to the soul, Iamblichus says, quote, "It does not even have need of the experiences which control sense perceptions, for it is not at all confined within a body, and not being constrained in any way, it has no need of exercising perception by means of corporeal organs." The experience of the soul being outside the body, and yet still seeing, confirms this. In this state, the soul still sees with an omnivision, not limited by the physical eyes, as confirmed in countless near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. This is an experiential proof Iamblichus is likely using to establish trust in the assertion that greater beings, greater states of being, are involved in designing and consenting to the embodied human life. Because once you have experienced the out-of-body state, you can comprehend how man's sense apparatuses are actually more densified and limited systems for what is already naturally experienced by the soul, namely a more advanced form of the senses and the inclusion of other senses that remain dormant while the soul experiences the idea of a compression through the human body. The body plays a crucial role in Iamblichean theurgy and cannot be left out of the equation. The body downloads the spiritual enterprise into the physical world, allows archetypal patterns of consciousness to live in the world through us. Why we have consigned ourselves to such dense limitation is nonetheless a mystery. But as Iamblichus teaches, one does not always have to be aware of the meaning of things to take part in them, nay, even be used by that meaning and possessed by its suitable deity. Iamblichus says that the passions of the human body, which can lead us into so much darkness, are not to be totally repressed and stored away. If we bottle up our passions, they only build with pressure. In theurgy, the passions are intentionally exercised. Quote, "If one exercises them in brief bursts, and within reasonable limits, they enjoy moderate relief and find satisfaction, and hence, being purified, are laid to rest through persuasion and not by violence." This is the reason that people feel like their passions have been exercised when they watch a stage play or a tragedy. Quote, "And similarly in the sacred rites, by viewing and listening to obscenities, we are freed from the harm that would befall us if we practiced them." Iamblichus is here, and in other places, defending certain seemingly bizarre ritual practices against Porphyry's more rationalistic approach. There are in theurgical rituals states of glossolalia, where individuals chant meaningless utterances. These utterances and mantras do not necessarily conform to any known language, and even though the practitioner does not know what the sounds mean, the emotional state changes nonetheless. The meaning of these utterances then is comprehended by the deity invoked, or the meaning doesn't matter at all, but rather the internal transformation taking place. I have, for my own part, experienced the potential such practices have for engaging a variety of phenomena, especially due to the fact that certain chants initially brought me out of my comfort zone and then reordered my emotional state into a profound sense of relief and confidence. These utterances and chants, coming through also in harmonic tones, have not only an effect akin to musical euphoria, but the chanter may feel as though they are the ones being chanted by the deity, whereupon the practitioner relinquishes control to a higher power. Any master musician or vocalist who performs off the cuff will have an intimate understanding of how this feels. To any rudimentary observer, this could be an example of a possession, which in the theurgical sense is the polar opposite of being possessed by some so-called evil daemon. The gods and beings partaking in these rituals and states of consciousness are not drawn down, but they summon the soul of the practitioner upward to themselves and turn the focus of the theurgist toward the first principle. This is why the practitioner feels lighter and raised up, although they are still bound to the body. And Iamblichus makes it clear that it is by virtue of divine love that all intelligences are bound and able to engage with the soul, even to the point of becoming partners in our journey to Henosis, or divine union with the One, which is ultimately the salvific goal of theurgy. In this way, we raise into union with greater states of being, and take on these unities as aspects of ourselves, quote, the more we ascend to the heights, and to identity with the primal entities in form and essence, the more we raise ourselves up from particulars to universals, the more we discover the eternal union that exists there. There were more discoveries than union to be had there, including, quote, conceptions of what goes on in the cosmos. As regards to the soul's union with the gods, it, quote, heals sick bodies and rearranges many things that were discordant and disorderly among human beings, and also it often transmits the discoveries of human skills, legal regulations, and the establishment of customs. This certainly bodes well for all the inventors and geniuses who were inspired to make some of their greatest discoveries through dreams or altered states. Now, if we actually believe that we are not our isolated physical selves having a separate experience generated by some meaningless cosmic accident, but that our consciousness is the great fundamental unifier binding all that is, then we can consider how greater sentient beings are able to interact with us in ways we can't understand or always be aware of. This can certainly explain the experiences of having inspirations that we don't feel responsible for. Rather, we have aligned ourselves to some kind of harmony, which allows us to become a conduit. Prayer has always contained this underlying implication of a belief in telepathy with greater beings, whether they be gods, daemons, or the one and only source. Prayer, then, is a means of telepathy between the praying subject and the intelligent object. To the theurgist, prayer is magical, and is a means of not compelling the gods to do one's bidding, but coming into resonance with a god in a reverential act. To the theurgist, a prayer will contain far more power if it is charged with the appropriate energy, such as that evoked in a theurgic ritual. Quote, if it seems to you incredible that the incorporeal should hear a voice, you are deliberately forgetting the faculty of the primary causes for knowing and comprehending in themselves all that is inferior to them. Iamblichus's detractors are quite often lacking the divine experience necessary to understand him, overestimate the rational mind's ability to comprehend theurgy, or they are of the age-old camp that attaches every divine phenomena with the nauseatingly lazy and dismissive adjective of demonic. Either way, Iamblichus affirms the notion that humans are, quote, incapable of attaining knowledge of these things by the aid of reasoning, but thinking that it is possible, are born entirely towards the human passions that are familiar to them, and on the basis of their own condition make conjectures about the gods. Iamblichus never once suggests an invocation should be done for any utilitarian or perverted reason. He emphasizes that the achievements of theurgy are to be done with a benign will and are always friends to love. Once this alignment to the benevolent is substantial enough, and the participating human has invited greater powers to take part through the will, quote, divinity uses them as instruments. Hence, when divinations are rightly effected, in the way which I have mentioned, then they subsist without falsehood. But when the soul has been previously disturbed, or is moved in the interim, or the body intervenes and confounds the divine harmony, then divinations become turbulent and false, and the enthusiasm is no longer true nor genuine. The sacred triad of practice for Iamblichus was philosophy, theology, and theurgy. In terms of his theology, Iamblichus, for the most part, builds upon the classic Platonic hierarchy. This begins with the ineffable One, whose first emanation is the demiurgic nous, moving on to gods, daemons, heroes, and souls, with certain other complex unities and monads also being the first emanations of the One. Iamblichus, as well as Porphyry, also recognizes three other classes of beings below the gods and above the heroes, namely archangels, angels, and archons, which is a unique inclusion respective to other Platonists. And at the level of the soul there is selected by each a guardian daemon, who can be summed up in the following, quote, This daemon, then, stands as a model for us even before the souls descend into generation. When a soul has selected a daemon as its guide, then straightaway it stands over it as the fulfiller of the various levels of life of the soul, and as the soul descends into the body, it binds it to the body, and it supervises the composite living being arising from it, and personally regulates the particulars of the life of the soul, and all our reasonings we pursue thanks to the first principles which it communicates to us, and we perform such actions as it puts into our minds. This is another way of reaffirming the idea that we are not alone in any of our noble pursuits, but can act in alignment with a higher nature, specifically designated as our guardian and a source of inspiration, intuition, and one of guiding ideals and actions. This extends even to moments of clairaudience where we can hear an internal voice outside of our control. In Book 8, Iamblichus introduces a number of Egyptian theologies from his priestly guise as a Baman, learned in the Hermetic writings. These divine hierarchies have alterations possibly unique to Iamblichus, but he admits straight away that there circulated many different opinions among the Egyptian scribes, and still does. In Egypt, it was typical to have varying theologies depending on the province and priesthood. In different periods, one god like Osiris would overtake another god like Ra in popularity, and there arose many conceptions about the first principle and all the gods that followed. Even in the Corpus Hermeticum, we find different Hermetic authors contradicting one another in their theological particulars. In the main Egyptian setup, Iamblichus presents the One as Ikten, and the Demiurge as Kemef or Kim-Atef, which can become Amun-Re, Osiris, or Ptah, depending on the manner of the Demiurge's power that's being focused on. Next comes a group of 8 deities reminiscent of the Ogdoad worshipped in the city of Hermopolis. And below these deities are the 36 decans, each marking 10 degrees in the purely Egyptian division of the heavenly circuit. This is but one of many examples of Iamblichus's close relationship to the Hermetic corpus. And he stresses, too, that these are not just theories. Quote, "They certainly do not just speculate about these things. They recommend rising up through priestly theurgy toward the higher and more universal levels above fate to the god and craftsman, and without material attachment or any other help at all except by observing the proper time." That proper time reminds us of the story of Iamblichus knowing which hour of the day was most applicable to a theurgical ritual. In this case, he was not just speculating, but affecting reality in line with a tradition also accepted by Hermetic Egyptians. He goes on to say that Hermes has also set out this path. In this way, Iamblichus once again harmonizes with the Hermetic method of ascension. This adds gravity to the idea that Iamblichus is a Hermetic philosopher. Clearly, it is possible to be Hermetic and Platonic and Pythagorean all at once, but Iamblichus cares less about such categorical heritage than he does the truth as he sees it, and the pursuit that constitutes the end of a great many esoteric schools. Considering theurgical Henosis is the Iamblichean aim, and a range of divine beings are involved in this process, we will conclude this essay with a focus on Book 2, where Iamblichus describes the ways in which daemons, angels, gods, and other beings, quote, appear to those invoking them. It becomes quite clear in the reading that every divinity, from the gods on down to good and evil daemons, heroes, and souls, are capable of showing up in the ritual process of photagogia, whether they come through external manifestations or internal visions. The purity of the rituals are paramount to what they connect with, and one of the primary aspects of these appearances are the different kinds of lights and movements they exhibit, as well as what is going on in the consciousness of the practitioner. For instance, a soul or apparition of a soul may take on a shadowy form if it is engrossed in the physical life, or the practitioner himself may shine out with an aura if they are imbued by a superior being and have an epiphanic download, wholly entrusted to them from a source beyond themselves. Gods are said to shine benignly and affect a tranquility, while daemons can be numerous and frightening. The archons can also harm the viewers if they are affecting matter. To Iamblichus, these appearances were not without a certain order and a definite risk, which made it important to determine what was what by observing how the being manifested. Quote, "Divine appearances flash forth a beauty almost irresistible, seizing those beholding it with wonder, providing a wonderful cheerness, manifesting itself with ineffable symmetry, and transcending in comeliness all other forms. We should contemplate these visions and manifestations by putting ourselves in the place of the Theurgist, who has just performed the ritual, and now, with a heart-opening warmth filling her, chills crawling up her back with a sense of profound love and meaning growing, and then, out from the clouds above the temple, a radiant form flashes, dazzling the eye and, in an instant, bestowing a personal vision to the practitioner, whether it be a divination or a precognition of a future event, or a clear vision that allows the practitioner to make a pivotal decision they have been wrestling with in their life. These visions, in this way, are not just limited to euphoria and wonder, but can lead the practitioner on a new course of life. Just as well, these manifestations serve to solidify the practitioner's belief in the divine and can result in a more decisive dismissal of vice. Iamblichean theurgy is far from being the tricks of mystery makers, who artificially cause statues to appear to speak, or lights to flare up from hidden contraptions, as had happened from time to time. For, quote, "The magnitude of the epiphanies, in the case of the gods, manifests itself to the extent that they sometimes hide the entire heaven, both sun and moon, and the earth is no longer able to stand firm as they make their descent." Iamblichus further conveys his nuanced experience with such phenomena by explaining how visions come with different degrees of vividness, light, and revelation. He offers a few descriptions akin to the kaleidoscopic ascension of a psychedelic sojourn, where a new reality unfolds that becomes more real than waking reality. Higher divinities convey immediate truths and simple profundities, whereas daemons are more likely to obscure themselves and, unlike angels, draw souls downward into matter and things pertaining to the worldly life. Heroes, too, can manifest in visions, and will cause the observer to partake in a sense of courage relating to direct actions in the world. Another name for theurgists are athletes of the fire, for divine beings, quote, "show in particular performers of the sacramental rites the fire in a direct vision of divinity. It is the accomplishment of acts not to be divulged and beyond all conception, and the power of the unutterable symbols, understood solely by the gods, which establishes theurgic union." The gulf between theurgy and mere bookworm intellection, or physicalist rationalism, is as wide as the void between earth and moon. For, quote, "divine union and purification actually go beyond knowledge." It was plain for Iamblichus that there were those who are capable of viewing superior beings, and those who are not. It is no surprise that many Platonic scholars are disturbed when they come to Iamblichus and refuse to recognize theurgy as the culmination of centuries of Platonic development, or regard Iamblichus's phenomenology as some kind of rhetorical wordsmanship. But every major Platonist after Iamblichus was a theurgist. Iamblichus can be regarded as an initiate among the initiated, and he often stresses the idea that divine realities are conveyed through symbols, but are not to be confused with the symbols themselves, however much the profane will seek to drag the meaning of said symbols into something conforming to their lower nature. In this way, divine realities have a way of protecting their own sanctity, with or without our involvement. I close this essay with a promise of more study in Iamblichean philosophy, theology, and theurgy, and with a description of the eudaimonia, which encapsulates the reason why the results of theurgy can lead the soul to greater summits. Quote, "Further, the gifts that arise from these manifestations are not all equal, nor do they bear the same fruits. But the advent of the gods gives us health of body, virtue of soul, purity of intellect, and in a word, the elevation of everything within us to their proper principles. It removes the cold and the destructive element in us, while it increases the vital heat and renders it more powerful and dominant, and makes all things commiserate with soul and intellect, makes our light shine with intelligible harmony, and shows what is not body as body to the eyes of the soul by means of those of the body." If not for having picked up Thomas Taylor's translation of On the Mysteries many years ago, I may have never started this channel to begin with. He answered so many questions I had and still have about Hermes and Hermeticism. I would recommend anyone with a serious interest in philosophy in the Western esoteric tradition to struggle their way through On the Mysteries, and then return to it. At least then, no one can ever tell you that the Western tradition is lacking compared to the East. Please like and subscribe, and consider supporting my channel through Patreon, linked below in the description. I look forward to connecting with you. Be well. Thank you.